I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I have a returning guest. It's his third time on this podcast, but second time that I've interviewed him 88 episodes ago. 88 episodes ago in episode 12. So in fact, Paul was one of my first new interviews because I was recycling some of the stuff that I had done for other shows and other things. And so when we did Survivor Song, that was one of the first interviews I did for this podcast. So Thank you, Paul, and welcome back.
Sure. Happy to be back, David.
Yeah. And so what's really cool since the last time we talked is a film based on one of my absolute favorites of your novels, Cabin at the End of the World. I mean, it's kind of personal because I got to see you read from it here at Mysterious Galaxies at the old location. And so that book has a special place in my heart, but we just recently got a movie, Knock at the Cabin, based on this book. So I don't want to belabor it a lot because I want to get to this book that we're talking about, but that must have been a really cool and crazy experience for you to have this year, including a movie premiere and all that.
Yeah, no, cool and crazy is definitely correct in the short version, from, just about maybe, geez, almost like a full year ago where I was getting ready to go visit the set for a couple of days. And then, all the stuff in between. And, then actually, being able to take a year off from school because of it and, and going to the premiere with my family. Yeah, it's been a pretty head-spinning year.
Right. And just for me, just as a fan of your work, to see, especially for example, Dave Bautista, who was just the most amazing and perfect casting for that book. Just seeing, your work out of your head on the big screen was really exciting, even if the ending was different. And but it just had to be a really cool experience to see one of your books realized in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it is it's a strange experience, in a good way. I hope all writers get a chance to sort of, see their story sort of refracted or retold. When I first saw the movie, it's a little bit of a blur, but I felt like by the end of it, I felt like I had run 10 miles. I was just emotionally all worked up and exhausted. I mean, there were times where I got teary-eyed because it was at not sad parts, but just because, wow, that's right out of the book. And I'm so glad they kept that, this piece or that piece. But there were also times my visceral reaction was to want to get up and run out of the theater and keep running. But right. I stayed for the whole thing. And I've seen it. I guess I've seen it 3 times at this point now.
Yeah. And I did hear in one of the interviews, and there's plenty of interviews out there where you talked about this book, so we don't have to go too far into it, but that you did ask Uncle Steve for advice on how to handle seeing one of your books turned into a movie. And by Uncle Steve, I, of course, mean the uncle of our genre, Stephen King. And that must have been really cool to because I'm sure he had a lot of good advice for how to handle that emotionally, right?
Yeah, it's funny. So obviously he's had so many things adapted. I just asked him quickly, hey, what's it, how's it been like? How do you deal with it, etc. And he had just almost offhandedly mentioned that, some have been terrible. This is, for Steve, but, some it feels like what he's seeing on the screen, they somehow walked into his head and put what's on there. So, I mean, I didn't feel like that when I watched Cabin, just because I have such, I don't know, I have such strong images of what ended up being in the book in my head. That includes the people who were the characters and, in the cabin and stuff like that. But it was amazing to see the cabin, especially in person. And, the actors I thought were one of my favorite parts of the movie itself. I feel like they really inhabited the emotional lives of those characters.
Absolutely. And the set looked amazing. So it looked like it was a really, so being on the set, I'm sure was an amazing experience, but
Yeah.
yeah. But again, there's plenty of interviews out there on it. But I want to talk about Pallbearers Club because I think, um, for me personally, and it's the, I hear people talking about this book, and there is buzz out there. But for me, this is such a powerful book. I feel like there should be more, and for that reason, I really wanted to drill down on this book. And I wouldn't say it's my favorite of your works, but I think it's your best novel by far. I
Oh,
think
thank you.
I think you're doing some really excellent things. And when we get into spoilers, we're going to talk about some of the tricks that you kind of pulled off in this book. And that's one of the reasons why I had the experience of reading this book and a lot of the times being, like, that cheeky dude, he did it, he got it, he did this. Oh my gosh, this is so cool. I had a lot of moments like that.
Oh, thanks.
What was the seed for Pallbearers Club? Was it what I mean, some of it might be spoilery, so
Yeah,
but I'm
not too
sure you're used to
spoilery.
answering
Yeah.
this.
So the seed was the title. Just sort of fell into my lap. I just finished Survivor Song. It was November of 2019, maybe October. I mean, right around in there, October, November of 2019. I was at school, and my school on Monday mornings does school-wide announcements because we're a small, like, private school, so they have everybody get together. Poor timing because no one wants to be there Monday morning. It's sort of like a cruel time to do it. But anyway,
Yeah.
after, like, people give speeches, a senior went up to make an announcement, and he walked up and said, "Hey, I'm starting this thing called the Pallbearers Club." And he described it as they would serve funerals and wakes for elderly or homeless that don't have a lot of living relatives. So the educational professional in me was like, "Oh, what a sweet community service thing to do." But the horror writer in me was like, "Oh my God, I
Right.
have to use this somehow." Yeah.
Right.
So after writing Cabin at the End of the World and Survivor Song, um, I was looking for something different to write. Not that those two books are similar, but they're similar in structure. Like, I mean, I would say those are probably the most thrillery sort of structured books of mine. They take place over a small period of time, and there is, a lot of sort of plot story that goes to it. And I wanted to write something different. Um, and so this idea sort of fit the bill. It's like, oh, I'm going to have this book that starts in the late 80s because of the teenager that had gone up to make the announcement. He was a very sort of quiet, nice kid. Wasn't one of, like, the bigger personalities of the school, shall we say. So I
Right.
instantly imagined myself as a high schooler. I was like, oh, what would, there's no way I would have done that in high school. So instantly that seemed like a nice uh, built-in piece of conflict, was to have this really awkward, shy kid, start a club. And that was really sort of where it started.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too because and I think part of the marketing of this book was because I didn't read any of the, like, Dust Jacket or any of those things until after I had read the book, because that's just my method.
Yeah.
I am a Paul Tremblay fan, and I'm going to read your books, and I don't want to know. I knew a little bit because you talked about it in both of the last two times you were on the show, a little bit,
Okay.
and I only knew what you had said on the show, which was not very much, but just a
Yeah.
little tease. And so when I looked back and saw the marketing, it kind of looks like, psychological thriller, or it doesn't seem as obviously horror as the book ends up really being. It is a horror novel in many respects, but for example, as being on the Dust Jacket, it's called a psychological thriller.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, was that a conscious effort to try and shield, like, some of the plot from the reader as it comes out? Um, or how much of the, because I know sometimes we don't have any control over what happens on the
Yeah.
Dust
I would say
Jacket.
it's more the latter. And I
Yeah.
kind of wish maybe I, uh, put more into it. I mean, they send me the back copy of the jacket. Sometimes they ask me to write, like, and get a start on it.
Right.
Um, I don't know. maybe it depends on the publisher and the editor, but yeah, usually they'll ask me, hey, can you write like that paragraph summary? Or I think the last few books is, hey, someone wrote this. Do you want to edit it? Which I think I've done the last couple times.
Right.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, generally, like, I don't want to think about marketing the book. Like, I want to just write the book, and, let the publisher deal with that stuff. But yeah, I don't know. They've never really put horror on any of my spines. I mean, they always say like psychological suspense or something. Like, even if you go back to Head Full of Ghosts,
Right.
doesn't say, I mean, different time too. That was 2015, when people were still being told that no one publishes horror novels. It's
Right.
kind of fun, like how quickly that's changed. Um,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think what my publisher was thinking was because, the Cabin at the End of the World and Survivor Song did pretty well with a crossover into like the thriller suspense space. They wanted to sort of keep that going. And I tried to warn my editor, I'm like, hey, this next book is not a thriller. Uh, without any pejorative attached to the word thriller. It's just, this is not what it is. So I can see like people, thinking, oh, this is a thriller and being disappointed because the Pallbearers Club is not, it's not plot heavy. It's not, this happens and this happens and this happens quickly. There's a lot of sort of interior space and interior rumination and stuff like that.
Well, and it's a horror novel, but in a sneaky way, right?
Hmm.
And so one of the things about this book, and we'll get into it, is that it's a coming of age horror novel. But what's great about it is we're starting to see, because the coming of age horror novel, we most associate it with like Stand By Me or
Hmm.
Boy's Life, Robert McCammon, those or Neverland by Douglas Clegg. And some of these books, like, these are all written by people who grew up in the 50s and 60s and have that kind of feel to it. And what's
Right.
awesome is, and one of the things I love about Pallbearers Club is part of that, it's part of our generation where we've got a little bit, and it's funny because Keen's Ghoul is like right on the edge because of when he
Uh-huh.
grew up, right? But we're starting to get more of the punk rock and the heavy metal and the stuff. And of course, I loved, and a lot of my listeners are gonna love, the punk horror angle of this, because and we'll dive more into that, but
Uh-huh.
it gave it a very different feeling of coming of age, because you and I, for example, came of age in a different age. You know what I'm
Sure.
saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so here's the thing is, like, you always have to tell people, like, the coming of age novels are definitely going to have autobiographical elements, but they're not, you're fictionalizing, right?
Yeah.
So, but there was little bits and pieces of you obviously in this. And you said you were trying to picture yourself in this. So let's talk about that
Sure.
coming of age aspect, because I called it a coming of age horror novel. Do you consider it a coming of age horror novel? Because I do.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I think that does fit. Does fit. Sorry, I spent the afternoon standing in the cold watching a soccer game. My mouth is just de-thawing out. Um, yeah, it was funny. Like I did go into it partly excited because, hey, I'm going to start this in the late '80s when I graduated high school, but I didn't want this to feel like Stranger Things. Which is fun. Listen, I'm not gonna like just be like a horror hipster and be like, I hate Stranger Things. No, I watch it. It's a lot of fun. I love watching it with my daughter, especially. But like I didn't want there to be like nostalgia. I wanted to be like, hey, this took place in this time. This guy was having a rough time then too. It wasn't like, oh, everything was great in the late '80s and early '90s, because it wasn't. Um, so there's that part of it, like as you see sort of the commercialization of I say our, like, not that it's ours, but like of the time that we grew up, right? Those '80s and '90s. Um, I don't know. I just want it to feel like more like, this kid's coming to age a little bit later than most, I suppose, but these are the real struggles that he sort of went through. Plus maybe a vampire, which isn't a huge spoiler.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
here's
but
the
no, that's
thing.
sort of what I was thinking. It's funny. Last thing I would say is you mentioned, all those different books, and it's funny. Like I think obviously Stephen King probably informs on story wise most of my coming of age stuff, because he would always, as you mentioned, set stuff in the '50s, '60s, and music was such a powerful way to set that sort of setting, right? Like he's referencing rock and roll from the 50s and 60s in certain different novels. So yeah, I'm gonna, we're gonna start off talking about Def Leppard, but then quickly move into, the punk and alternative bands of the 80s and 90s.
Right, and we'll drill down on that because there's a part that was my favorite part of the book, um, that is a drill down on that. But the thing about it is I wasn't sure when I called it a coming of age novel if you would even think of it that way. I just very much identified with this as a coming of age novel because that's the era that I was coming of age,
Yeah,
and Art Barbara in the story is a person who's coming of age very much mirrored mine, right?
right.
And so for example, and sorry to toot my own horn for a minute, but like my coming of age novel that came out from Deadite in 2014 was Boot Boys of the Wolf Reich, and it
Mhm.
was skinheads and werewolves. But to me, like that, the anti-racist skinhead thing was a part of my growing up.
Yeah,
And when I was 15 to 16, Agnostic Front and Cro-Mags and all that
yeah.
stuff was a huge part of my life. And so it made sense to me to write a coming of age novel that involved that stuff. And so it's funny because I think one of the things that I really loved about Pallbearers Club is that you have these two really interesting characters, Mercy and Art, who, um, by some of the tricks that we'll talk about in the spoiler section, you take, because one of the things about a coming of age novel is they're inherently kind of an unreliable narrator, always, because it's always the first person, almost
Mhm.
always the first person of somebody looking back on their glory days or their
Right.
childhood, either their glory days or when they were tortured in school or whatever. And with this novel, you have Mercy like reading it with us and kind of side by side, like picking apart the novel and calling bullshit on parts of it, which
Right.
was I'm gonna drill down on that in the spoiler section because I think you did some really neat and amazing things with it. But that's what I think made this like no other coming of age novel that's ever been done before, and gave it a really unique thing, but also like made it a conversation. How soon in the process did you kind of come up with that? Is that always part of the seed?
Yeah, well, hmm. I think, once I had I took my time, like before I actually started, like, I just said that I had the title in November, but I didn't actually start, even writing stuff in my notebook until much, months and months later. So the first thing after the title was figuring out what was going to be the quasi supernatural angle to it, where I came across Mercy Brown's story, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Um, and so then for me, it was like a little bit after I had Mercy Brown, like this friend slash frenemy, it became a little bit of a logic thing to me. It's like, okay, this book is being presented as the found memoir of Art Barbara. So I'm like, okay, who found it? His friend Mercy found it. What is she going to do with it? And based on what I imagined her personality was going to be, is like, oh, she's not going to be able to resist commenting and refuting on things. So not only basically writing rebuttals at the end of each chapter, but also like crossing stuff out and writing in the margins. Um, yeah, just playing with the idea of like your past and how much of it you sort of use to create your story, how much of it creates you as well, and how, I mean, it's definitely, there's a lot of wiggle room and blurry lines there. Yeah, so like, I'd say the last thing about a coming of age story is typically a kind of coming of age story. There's sort of like, they grow up and like, oh, they learned all these lessons from their life. And I don't know. I don't know if that's the case for Art and
No,
Mercy. Like,
yeah,
I think he kind of like stay in a lot of ways. He's still the same, maybe much to his disappointment. Although I do think there's some growth too. But anyway, it's messy. I guess that would be
yeah,
the thing to
yeah.
say.
Well, and that's the thing, and that's why I wasn't sure if you considered it a coming of age novel, because there is much of it is about Art as an adult, but I
Yeah.
think so much of the table setting is the teenage angst and isolation, which we'll get
Sure.
to in a minute. You find now, Head Full of Ghosts, you got to shout out Bad Religion in a big way. And in this one, I mean, you had the line of dialogue, I could be the Grant Hart to your Bob Mould. and you had the chapter titles with the Husker Du albums.
Yes.
And because I know those albums, I spent each time the chapter, I'd go back and every once I'd be like, well, oh man, I got to go listen to this album and see
Nice.
if
Yeah.
it informs the chapter or was it random. And I just read and had Jim Ruland on with his book about SST records.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah.
I luckily had just kind of gone back through the Husker Du catalog. I still not quite sure if it's random or intentional, but I did notice that you were aging up with Husker Du through the chapters, if I have that correct.
Oh, I'd have
Were
to go back
you?
and
Were
look.
they in the right order, or was I out of?
Yeah, they
Out
might be. That's a good question. That's interesting. I hadn't considered that part. I end up choosing like a lot of the titles, the song titles, because I felt like those song titles gave a little bit of a hints about what sort of happened in that chapter or the feel for that chapter. But that would be really cool if that actually happened. That that the songs aged forward too. I'll have to take a look at that. I hope
Yeah,
that's the
well,
case.
I could be wrong about that, but like
Yeah.
that was just my feeling. So maybe I
Yeah.
gave you too much credit there, but
Well, I mean, sometimes that's like the fun stuff that happens, like subconsciously, maybe.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
I'll still take credit. I will say the first opening chapter is definitely from Zen Arcade, and the last chapter is from the last chapter. I think Mercy Picks, and it's from Candy Apple Gray, which is definitely a later album.
Right.
But I think
Yeah.
there's a No Reservations in between, which is Warehouse. So not quite, but close.
Close. Close enough. I'll still give you credit
Cool.
for that. Well, and it was I think that's a good in joke, for people, the Husker Du stuff for those of us who came around then, and those of us who grew up in that era should feel more connection to this book just naturally.
Yeah. I mean, even if like you're not a Husker Du or punk fan, just the idea, I mean, it really was like in the 80s was sort of like the dawn of like the monster of pop culture. I mean, not that there wasn't any popular culture before that, but just the access to it and the amount that we consumed became exponential. Yeah, I think there's 2 points in time where that's happened. The 80s was the first time because of cable television,
Yeah.
where so many more households in the VCR were able to see movies, instead of having to pay, and actually going out to see movies. So now, that's as a kid of the 80s, that's I just watched a ton of television. That was my exposure to story. It was all these things on cable TV. And so I think that was really where like a birth of a new kind of super fan. And I think my hope was even if readers weren't Husker Du fans, they could somewhat relate with the idea of being a super fan or having, if it's not a band, a TV show, but in this case, a band that, means so much to the teenage you and something that sticks with you as an adult.
Right. Well, and one thing that this novel does is capture the difference between um, the punk rock teenage angst and isolation pre Smells Like Teen Spirit, because I do think
Yeah.
that and I've written a lot about this myself, but like the world before that video and the world after that video, it's
Yeah.
crazy how much being a punk rocker changed. And because that kind of fear and isolation that you get from being a weirdo back then, like it's hard to explain to people how like rednecks and jocks like just wanted to beat us up just because we were different,
Yeah.
right? And then after um Smells Like Teen Spirit, they wanted to dress like us,
Right.
and they were suddenly listening to music that was adjacent, or they were discovering Bad Brains, for example,
Yeah.
or whatever, because maybe Kurt Cobain wore a shirt at one show or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to explain to people who weren't alive back then what the one-to-one transmission of the virus of like punk rock and alternative music was
Right.
pre that. And that's one of the things on page 48. There's a part, and I'm going to read it because I think you captured this so well. Quote, I like some bands better than others, but every band was daring, challenging, and unlike anything played on local radio or MTV. This music was a new prism from which I viewed the world, a thrilling secret. For the first time in my life, I was in the know. Chords vibrate on a wavelength that fused me to the music And together we were bigger than a shouted chorus, and together we were as small as a promise. And for those 2 or 3 glorious minutes of song duration, we were the same. Um, dude,
Wow.
you killed me with this
Oh,
part,
thank
and
you.
that's why I singled it out in my review. Like that secret knowledge, and that's the thing. I have a buddy who does a Metallica podcast, Speak and Destroy, but he grew up in the Indiana hardcore scene with me, and we
Mhm.
talk about, when Metallica became popular, because we both liked Metallica beforehand,
Yeah.
and we were always talking about the secret knowledge. How back then, if you read the magazines and you were the kid at school who could come in and say, "Have you heard the Dead Kennedys?"
Yeah.
Have you heard the Misfits? Let me play the Misfits for you. You you were finding your tribe, but you had the secret knowledge. And so the fact that you got the thrilling secret and the promise, just kudos. I just love that part. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or I just
Oh,
wanted to
thank you.
get it out.
No, I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of to me how tried to sum up like how I felt when I found this music. Um, I play with it a little bit in the book. Like, my first fandom, like in middle school, was like, oh, Def Leppard, Pyromania, and I didn't have any older siblings to help point me into a music direction. So it was really like in a lot of ways discovering stuff on my own until I got to college kind of thing. So I don't know. That was it was my first experience with something that would be considered countercultural, and then like you talked very well, very eloquently about how the counterculture became usurped by the mainstream culture. But as you said at the time, it felt like, oh, that this is for me. Like I didn't realize that there was actually something for me out there like that.
Yeah. Well, that's what my novel Punk Rock Ghost Story is very much about, the difference uh pre and post Nirvana, and to with a haunted punk rock tour van. But I was really, so it's funny because I felt a deep affinity for this book from specifically that, because it's like, um I felt a kinship to this because it's a feeling that I would like to see captured, and I think you captured it. So um, it's one that I think we need more people to get the point that kind of. I know it sounds silly, but I want people to understand, like, especially the young kid. Like, it's funny because I work in schools. You do too. So you probably see young punk rock kids wearing bands for shirts that we saw live before they were born, right?
Yeah,
And,
not as much. Oh, I don't, but yeah,
well, when I was in Portland, I saw that a lot.
that's cool. Yeah,
Yeah, and
I
I
see it through
was,
my sister, through my daughter, and some of
yeah,
her friends.
yeah,
I do see that from them, like wearing like a, a Velvet Underground t-shirt. Not that that's punk, but sort of maybe pre or
right.
proto punk. It's hard not to be obnoxious. Like, do you know any songs? And she did. She knew plenty of songs. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's just interesting because like the first time I saw a young kid, well, when I was living in Portland, I was working at the high school there, and I saw a kid in a 7 Seconds shirt, and I, started talking to the dude about seeing them at the Cubby Bear in Chicago in '89, and then I'm like realizing that's like a full 10 years before this kid was born,
Right.
and they're like looking at me like, you know, but they actually like this music, and they know it, and it's funny because I just keep expecting them to say like that's old guy shit, you know, and they
Yeah.
don't.
Well,
They like they like the old stuff, It's weird.
yeah, I saw or I heard somewhere. I listened to a music podcast briefly, and they talked about, and this was probably these numbers are probably like 6 to 12 months old, but at the time, like the number one decade in terms of streaming was the 90s. Um, and then it might be now, and then it was the 80s. I mean, so like it's funny that era. We're sort of, maybe it's because of the nostalgia thing. It's like it's always you look 30 years back, like when we were in the 80s was movies about the 50s, etc.
Right.
Um, but also like I don't know, it's such a different musical landscape now in terms of what you can access and what you can hear, and all the pollination and cross pollination that's happened. So no, I don't know. I mean, it's definitely cool to have kids go back and discover and still like the stuff we were listening to.
Right. Well, and I also see kids wearing Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and
Mhm.
stuff like that too. So they're going further back too. Yeah, I just the other day was walking down the street and I saw a teenager in a Bon Scott era like ACDC shirt, and I was just like really like kind of like wow, like I wonder if it's dad or
Yeah.
they just find this on their own. But it's interesting. So anything else you want to say before we get into spoilers to sell this book, because I want to actually start talking about the story a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Actually, the one thing I'd say, because I'll forget, is one of my favorite writers who's not a horror writer. I have plenty of those, but Sam Lipsyte, he writes the funniest books. He had a book, his most recent book, and I can't remember the full title of it. It's like No One Left to Say You're Wrong or something like that. And that's not the title, but it came out in December. And it has actually quite a bit in common with the Pallbearers Club insofar as this takes place in early 90s, early to mid 90s New York City, and basically this loser guy in like a bunch of terrible bands. But it's funny and it's so much fun. You should definitely read that.
I That sounds great. Well, and before we get into spoilers, just lastly, if you haven't read Paul Bear's Club and you're a Tremblay fan, I don't know what's wrong with you. Get on it. Uh,
And the
but we're gonna
paperback
get
is
into
out
spoilers.
now.
Yeah, and it's in paperback now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it just came out in paperback, and I do know that the hold line on my library for Paul Bear's Club was very long.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
popular at the library here in San Diego.
Great.
Excuse me, I had bronchitis a couple weeks ago, and now
Uh,
talking a lot is actually affecting it. Okay, so let's get into spoilers. This is your spoiler warning,
all
everybody.
right. Spoiler warning.
We got here pretty quick, 37 minutes. That's not bad because usually sometimes I get lost before getting to the spoilers. But so here's the thing. Art Barbara is how much of Art Barbara is Paul Tremblay, and how I mean there's a fair bit I can imagine,
Yeah,
but also I mean anytime you write a character you start inventing, right?
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a little like a two-way street. I mean, I feel like all characters, even the ones that are like totally different than I am, have something of me in there. But they also are characters. And so Art Barber is a little bit of the reverse of it. I mean, there's a ton of autobiographical stuff in there. But there is a point, where he becomes this, fictional character. Um, I mean, in terms of like, his high school experience and certainly all the health stuff that's described, that's all stuff that I've dealt with, the scoliosis and, checking out the heart stuff and,
Right.
uvula surgery, which is all kind of fun. That ended up, fitting sort of my view of the sort of like weird energy vampire thing, that all could sort of be a part of it. So yeah, I don't know. I've been sort of like cheekily saying like art is like 80% me, maybe a little over exaggerated versions of
Right.
me, and Mercy's maybe the other 20%. Like she's the inner critic, or the inner editor in my head. um,
Yeah,
apparently,
was that freeing to be able to like comment on your own book?
yeah,
Um,
definitely for sure.
yeah, yeah, we'll
you know,
get
and
more
that,
into that into
yeah,
that.
and I knew she had to be there too to, because art gets pretty like, woe is me, maudlin, on purpose. Um, so I knew part of her role would be to sort of, be there for the reader to sort of say what maybe the reader was even thinking, and to cut some of his maudlin stuff with humor as well.
Right. So it's interesting because you had this actual kid who's doing the Pallbearers Club. Did you spend time? Did you go talk to him about any experiences that he had?
I'm laughing because no, I basically just took the title of the club and ran.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have him as a student at the time. I had him when he was a freshman. I did actually stop him at one point a little bit later. I'm like, hey, how'd the club go? It didn't sound like it, if I remember correctly, it didn't sound like that they had done, like, he didn't sound like he had a ton of people that signed up and maybe they'd done like one or two kind of thing. Um, but yeah, no, I
Right.
didn't follow the club. I just, that part of it was just me sort of inventing it.
Hold on one second, Paul. I'm just gonna get my water bottle.
Sure, no problem.
Um, I was just realizing that if I'm coughing so much, maybe I should drink some water.
That's a good idea.
All right. On that note, so Art and Mercy have kind of this fleeting friendship, um, and I think that's a huge part of our friendships in the teenage years. They burn really hard and fast, and
Mm.
and sometimes you go through these friends and you never see them again, or you just talk to them briefly. And you talk about developing that friendship because I thought it was really kind of cool.
Yeah, thanks. To this point, I guess in my writing life, I mean, part of it is, making up, not making up things, but I don't know, fooling myself into doing things that seem exciting and new. Um, but also like having some sort of leaping off point. Like in my head, like all the novels are sort of connected in a way. So like Survivor Song, features the friendship between Romola and Natalie, and it's a very close, very loving, supportive friendship. And so I'm like, oh, and, in this book, I'm going to write a much more complicated sort of frenemy-ship, um, where, I do think Mercy is good for Art at certain times in his life, and obviously not so good for him, especially if she is a supernatural creature sucking off his life. Um, but the kind of friendship where, as you said, like it's so intense when they're near each other, and they both know they're probably not really great for each other, but it's just such an intense friendship, the kind that can pick right back up and fall into old habits, like even if you haven't seen each other for 10 years. It was also really important to me to not make it in any way like a romantic relationship either. I wanted it to be, this is totally platonic. There was never a thought, otherwise. Um, I don't know. And part of that was just like what the book ended up meaning to me. There's a great joke in What We Do in the Shadows, the movie. I'm going to butcher the joke. But like at one point, I forget what they're talking about, but um, I think someone interviewing said something like, oh, you're not going to have like, sex with like the virgin or sex with the person that you're going to, suck the blood from. And I forget who answers it this way. This is no, it's like, I've never wanted to fuck my sandwich, which yeah, it's just such a great joke. And I was like, yeah, like, Art wasn't going to be sexually attracted to Mercy because, in my head, Mercy represented my inner editor and a lot of my own doubts in my relationship with writing and mental health. So, like, I have no interest in being romantically entwined with that.
Right.
So anyway, yeah. So all that stuff were things that I sort of considered with Mercy.
Right. And so once you're doing this kind of this dialogue and you're writing Mercy's part of the story and you're writing Art's part of the story, and they're they're very different. How did you, how did you separate those in your mind, or when did you, how did you try to, when did you determine that this is a good point for Mercy to come in? Was it really just, in the moment, or did you have that thought out ahead of time?
Yeah, it was definitely for the most part by feel and in the moment. Like I don't think I mean I wasn't like writing, okay, this is the Art part, and then I would stop and go back. I mean, part of the fun to me when I was writing it was like if I had sort of like the inner editor squawking at me, it's like, okay, this is the point where I'm going to put Mercy in. Um, uh, yeah, so I didn't write the book in parts like that. She came up where it seems like, okay, this is where she would come up. That's not to say I'm sure I might have added a comment, or I certainly subtracted a bunch of comments, once I got through a draft and edited it and stuff like that. But no, for me, the fun was, it was a little time consuming, but it was also, I don't know, a good excuse. It was almost like a built in break. Like I would stop because I wrote this in Microsoft Word, have to set up a text box, so I'd be able to put Mercy's comment in and like size it, and maybe I would have it like tilted sideways or something. I don't know. That part I enjoyed.
Right. It kind of broke up your process at that point too. So, were there times where you were like, what are some fun examples of times where you, because I got the feeling that you were advancing the plot in really interesting ways from time to time by just being able to like turn a phrase to have Mercy be like, well, I don't know if I see it that way, or
Yeah.
your underlining parts, and like that must have been really fun to like give hints and clues and those kinds of things. um you know I don't know. Do you have any moments of those that you're particularly proud of with that? Because
Oh
I
shoot.
thought that was really neat throughout, and I'm not sure if I have a direct
Yeah.
example, but
No, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I thought like, um, yeah. No, I mean, I enjoyed all of them. Like, I don't know if I can think of a specific example, except for maybe toward the beginning of the book, like her first time going to a funeral. Art saying that like, um, oh, do you want to lift? Like, or Art was saying like, oh, he thought he heard her call from like the closet or from a different room. It's like, do you want to lift home or do you want to lift? And her commenting, like making a big deal of the word lift. Um, I thought was fun to maybe hopefully foreshadow like some of the things that would be floating and stuff later in the book.
well, one thing that I should tell you about a conversation I had with my buddy Mark Rothenberg, who does my best reads of the year episode every year with me. He's a big horror reader, lifetime,
Uh-huh.
my longest running horror nerd friend, and he has Pallbearers on his TBR. He hasn't read it yet, and I was talking to him the other day, and he said, and it was funny because I couldn't respond to what he was saying because I didn't want to give it away, but
Yeah.
he's like, you know what I really like about Tremblay? And I was like, what's that, Mark? And he was like, I really like that he plays with classic, genre storylines and puts his own spin on it. And, he did the possession and he
Oh,
did the,
thanks.
the
Yeah.
zombie thing. And then he's like, it's just with Pallbearers Club, he's not really doing that. Right. So, and I was like, uh, okay, no,
Maybe. Yeah.
did he? Did he not? Well, and that's the thing is you wrote your vampire novel, but you can't really like talk about it that way because that
Yeah.
kind of gives away the fun. So, you know, what I thought was cool about it was that it was a really cool entry point into the vampire novel and that's the thing. Another thing that I like about this book is that it's a couple different books all at once. Right, it's an unreliable narrator. It's a coming of age. It's a vampire novel. It's a urban legend novel. It's a lot of things,
Well, thank you.
but it's hard to talk about, right? Because you give it away.
Yeah, it has been.
Yeah.
It's funny. My good friend John Langan. Hopefully your listeners have read John's stuff. If not, make sure you guys change that. Start with the Fisherman. He's been on me for years. Like, when are you going to write a vampire novel? And I was like, no, I'm not writing a vampire novel. Just to be obstinate and just to tell John no, because that's our relationship. But yeah, so I guess I did sort of stumble my way into writing, sort of a riff on a vampire. Um,
Mm.
yeah, and the fun part was like Mercy Brown. Like I had no idea. Like, and that was part of like, how did I not know about this living in New England my whole life? How did I not know, you know, uh I shouldn't even call it like a folk tale, but like the folklore of what happened to Mercy Brown, because the stuff referenced in the novel about her being buried in 1892 and tuberculosis running through the family, all that stuff is, history. That stuff happened.
Right, and it was a case I didn't know anything about. So I had to think of there was at some point in the book where I was reading and I was like, wait, is this a real thing? And then I Googled it like on my phone and I was like, well, damn, there you go,
Yeah.
Paul Tremblay. This is a real thing. And then they added another level because then I was like, well, this novel is also going to be a completely different book for people who know that from the beginning, right? So
Right.
it also makes it operate on a different level. And I also love books that, you read it one way if you're this person and you read it another way if you're this person, and definitely regional books are that way. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure people that live in Maine, every Stephen King book is totally different.
No, for sure. And I mean, yeah, I mean, this book, by far the most positive response, not by, I don't go through and read people's reviews, but just in terms of people that reach out to me on social media, so many Gen Xers typically are the ones that reach out and say, oh, this book really spoke to me, really loved it, which is very cool. My hope was that, people who weren't Gen Xers would be able to connect with the book too. But who knows? So maybe it's overly Gen X. I don't know. But that's fine if it is.
Well, no, I mean, I think, well, at some point, I think other generations will find it. I mean, like, we didn't grow up in the 50s, but the body in Boy's Life that
Yeah,
spoke
yeah,
to our generation for sure,
right.
So they'll find it. And especially when word gets around that Paul Tremblay finally wrote his vampire novel, you know. And
Yeah.
and people are gonna, it was so funny because I couldn't give that away, to Mark, but
Yeah.
just told him we'll just get on it, dude. Like get on that book.
Yeah, he'll
Um
figure it out.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it was cool too because maybe I should have had this part of the discussion on the before we got into spoilers, but Mark and I did when I went home to Indiana and I was visiting him, and we did a couple like really nerdy things. Like we went to the Lilly Library, which is one of the largest archives in the Midwest, and we got to, for example, like hold a piece of Edgar Allan Poe's hair that they had there, and
Wow.
the first edition of Frankenstein, right?
Amazing.
And they have Ian Fleming's papers, and we saw the first draft of Goldfinger, where some other title was marked out and handwritten. He wrote Goldfinger on it, and one of the things that it's easy to forget, but like one of the other things we did on that trip was I went to the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis, and they've rebuilt Bradbury's office exactly how it was in his basement in LA in Indianapolis. And the desk where he wrote Martian Chronicles and the Illustrated Man and all that, it's there. The Halloween tree painting is there. His box of paint is there. And when you see this, you get a tactile like, holy shit, Ray Bradbury was a human being.
Yeah.
He sat at this freaking desk. Oh wait, you want to sit in the chair that he wrote Martian Chronicles in? Well, go ahead and sit there
Yeah.
because you're at the center, and it's a really amazing thing. And how I relate this to Pallbearers Club is, and we've hung out, before, and we've done a couple of these Zooms. But what was really interesting for me is that I had the experience of kind of really relating to Paul, the person, because I was like, oh yeah, we had the similar experience, and I really felt the experiences through art that and some of the things I felt like I knew you better reading this book. You know what I'm saying? And I
Yeah.
think I think there's certain books that authors write that are kind of more of a window into their soul than other
Sure.
ones. And what I really appreciated about and the reason I say this is because I was reading Pallbearers on that trip, right?
Ah.
And so when I got out of the Bradbury Center and I was waiting for my sister to pick me up, I was sitting on the campus reading Pallbearers, and I read this very kind of personal part about the scoliosis and
Mhm.
all that. And so I had like the combination of reading that part and sitting at Ray Bradbury's desk. And I really had a thought about, I had a lot of really deep thoughts about like what it means to get to know an author, because, you know, um, I just thought it was a neat thing. So I wonder how you feel about, do you feel like you bared your soul a little bit more in Pallbearers? Because
Yeah, for sure. And going into the book, well, there's a couple things like, one, going into the book, I felt like prior to writing is like, oh, I made this sort of self-discovery. I don't know, because people ask, I'm sure you get asked this too, especially when people write horror. It seems to always ask, why do you write this stuff? And
right.
they usually say it that way too.
Exactly.
um,
Yes.
well, like, so for me, like, part of why do I write horror, but even just like why do I write in general, I felt like, well, like in thinking about it and having to answer it so often, I felt like I made the self-discovery. It's like, oh, I think I do this because, you know, I don't know, for me, it felt like a strange thing to be a writer, because like I started off, studying math and, teach high school math. Anyway, so my self-discovery is like, oh, I think I do this stuff because I'm trying to, I didn't have a great time in high school, like so many people. It's like, I feel like I'm trying to prove that inner teenager that's in me, prove to that person that you have worth, you have something worth saying. And so like part of me is like, oh, maybe if I write this book, that'll be not exercising the demons, but sort of working some of them out kind of thing, which really didn't really work that way, unfortunately.
Mm.
But it's also, I'm very proud of the book. So on the flip side of it, so many of my stories, even though like they're totally different from my life, have like these sort of kernels of autobiography in them, some hidden, some not so hidden. And I was definitely worried after writing the book. I was like, oh man, did I just like empty the bucket? Like, I don't know what did I use it all in this book? It's all gone. But the bucket fills back up. But yeah, super personal. And it was a little hard not to take some criticism personally at times because art is so much,
Right.
an exaggerated version of myself. But yeah, so I don't know. But that was sort of like one of the things I wanted to do with the book. I wanted to explore that a little bit in, even in a meta way, to see what reaction would
Yeah.
be afterward.
Well, and mission accomplished on writing something different and
Yeah,
writing something that uses all kinds of great narrative tricks. I think it's funny because I feel like you're almost doing like kind of narrative magician stuff here by like having the two different voices and the contradicting things, and it makes Pallbearers Club so much more of a conversation than your typical novel, and
mm,
so that's one of the things that I think really sings about it, and it makes it
thank you.
I- you know uh, like I said, I don't know that it's my favorite of your work, but I think it's your best, and I
Thanks.
was incredibly um impressed by it. Like one of the reasons why Cabin probably will always be my favorite is I read it in basically one sitting on a flight.
Great.
And so um I I think like that's a unique experience with a book that you can have if you can,
Right.
especially that particular book. Like I because we were sitting on the we were sitting waiting to take off for like a really long time because the flight was delayed, and so and like I just it I was literally in, it was a one sitting read, and I think that
Yeah.
is something that's very unique and rare,
Yeah.
and cool, but so I think that added to that. But with Pallbearers, I think there's so many tricks you're pulling, and I just really really appreciate that. Now, on
Thank you.
that being said,
Mhm.
are there any of those like tricks or things that you got to do in this narrative that you're particularly proud of that you think maybe we didn't notice, maybe we did? Because here's the thing: is that a lot of the people who listen this
Yeah.
far into these spoiler discussions are the writers, and it's too late. You've already done it, so we can't do this.
Yeah.
But
Sure you
but
can. Yeah.
I think we'd like to hear a little bit about like how you tricked up this ride, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you again. Again, I think so much of it goes back to what I mentioned earlier that like the reason why Mercy would be commenting on the book, it had to be there. Like, I don't want it to ever feel like a cheap trick. I feel like not, I enjoy the band Cheap Trick, but we're going to stay on
Right.
the music side of things. But no, like it had to be part of and parcel of the story. It had to be that the story wouldn't be able to be told without it, kind of thing. Mainly because I have to be able to justify to my editor why I'm doing this, because that was definitely a big ask for Morrow to go through the extra expense of the design, and I didn't ask for the red ink. They did that themselves, which was very cool. Yeah, so I don't geez, I don't know if I have nothing jumps to mind. My hope is more like my hope is more that it doesn't feel like a as we said, a trick, that it feels like it's a natural part of the story. Um and I've
Trick
actually
is
been glad I've
fine,
been
dude. Trick
yeah.
is fine because
But I've been glad to hear, especially in the audio version, people talk about, oh, it takes a little bit to get used to the two narrators. But they said once you sort of acclimate to it, it's a
I
lot
didn't
of
even
fun.
think
And then
about how they would do
yeah,
this in audio. I didn't even, yeah.
yeah, it's a total disaster in ebook, but in audio, it sounds like they did an amazing job. Like I've heard from very many happy audio readers that was like a really great way to experience the story.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, yeah, and and it's cool to hear that this came from just somebody mentioning that they were doing this and in your school.
Yeah,
It's always a great piece of advice I got from uh John Shirley was, one time he told me, he's like, a lot of the writer's job is to listen.
Yeah.
and to like, oh, you're going to have experiences or something's going to come to you because somebody, you overheard something, or and you're always looking for those little pieces that you can use, and writers are always looking for life.
Right.
you
No,
know
it's what I try to trust what makes me excited. And every book's a little bit different. It could be a couple of characters, it could be a situation. In this case, it was just the title itself. Uh, that I could just tell by how excited I was, and the feeling is like, oh, I have to do something with this.
yeah,
Um, you know, and then like, you sort of trust your subconscious and trust yourself, and you trust your own passions, and you trust your own obsessions. All that stuff's going to end up in the book somehow.
right. Well, you gave us a little clue 88 episodes ago to what you were working on. So as a reward to the people who stayed and listened for this spoilery stuff,
Yeah.
what are you working on now, Paul? Like, is there anything you can hint at us with, or?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I've done a fairly good job with my year sabbatical from teaching, and got like quite a bit of writing done. So, first up is a short story collection coming out in July called The Beast You Are.
Has a new novella, correct?
Yeah, so there's 15 stories, but really I would say like one third of the book in word count, almost like half in page count because of how it's designed. But the original novella is called The Beast You Are, and it's an anthropomorphic animal story that also features a giant monster. And I wrote it in free verse. um, Honestly, it was the most fun I've ever had writing. It's not to say it was easy writing, but I just had a blast doing it. And it's really like a love letter to Watership Down, Secrets of Nim, again, these things that, in the 80s that were so important to me. Also like, um, Animal Farm. And actually, maybe more recently, there was a novel in the early or the first decade of the 2000s called Sharp Teeth by Toby Barlow, which is a wonderful LA werewolf novel written in free verse. So often, like a lot of my ideas come from like, I want to try something like that, or I want to take these things from these different works that are really cool and try to put my own spin on them. So anyway, that's the novella. I hope people like it. As I said, there are other short stories in that collection too. Um, but really quickly, otherwise, I finished a draft of a novel that I turned into my editor about a month ago. It's called Horror Movie, a Novel. Um, yeah, I think it's quite different than the previous books. Yeah, maybe like a little bit of a head full of ghosts feel to it in terms of how it's structured, but um, yeah. So I don't know. Like that book is in a lot of ways, I think it's going to be quite disturbing. Hopefully, funny too at times. My experience with Hollywood is definitely informing this book. uh, I shall say. But yeah, so those are the two biggest things. One finished the collection, obviously, and the book will be coming out next summer. 24, summer 24.
Yeah, it's funny. I was listening to an interview with Bruce Campbell and Robert Tuppert, or the producers,
Tappert, yeah,
Tappert, and they
yeah.
were talking about making Army of Darkness, and I was like, how has this never been a novel or a movie? The story of making Army of Darkness
Yeah,
is just absolute insanity. and
for sure.
but I just I love a good uh movie making story. So it's about the making of a movie, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, there's a lot of books out there. There seem to be a ton coming out too. So it's like, oh man. I mean, hopefully mine's different enough. um, so yeah, the conceit is that there was this movie made in the early 90s in Rhode Island by a bunch of 20 somethings. They pretty much filmed the whole thing, but it never made it to screen because there was something terrible that happened at one point. And so the book cuts back and forth between um, the character who played sort of the villain in the movie in 1993. It's about him going through the process of they're trying to, Hollywood's trying to reboot or remake this movie. But he's also talking about his experience on in the original movie, and that's intercut with actually the entire screenplay of the original 1993 movie. Um,
Hmm.
so it sounds complicated, but it's not. And it's actually a fairly short novel too. Um, it's one of my shorter ones, probably as short as Survivor Song.
Huh.
But
Well, and that
yeah,
was amazing to get a sabbatical for a year to to focus on writing.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, I knew with the movie coming out, I was going to be busy. but I also, I had that book was contractually due by May, so I felt like I knew like January and February probably were going to be a wash with the movie stuff.
Yeah,
So I wanted to make sure I had time to finish the novel. So my school was very good about letting me have the sabbatical.
that's awesome. All right. Well, Pallbearers Club is out on paperback now.
Correct?
So how different was the design aspect for the is it the exact same interior design?
Yeah, exact same except no red ink.
No red ink. Okay. So if you want red ink, you gotta get the hardcover.
You got to get the hardcover.
Well, before I think I mentioned to you before, like I went and decided I had to buy it. I looked on the library website, and there was 115 holds on
Whoa!
like 25 copies at our
Wow!
library, and I was so stoked. And I
Yeah,
was like, "Thanks, knock at the cabin," but
that's
because
cool.
yeah, I was super stoked on that, and just the attention that was out there, and I'm sure I wasn't the first person that was like, "All right, now I gotta go get this hardcover." Um,
Nice. Well, I hope. Thanks.
yeah, and but as a dedicated library user, I was stoked to see that
Awesome.
because yeah, I think well, no, and I know I've talked to there's a purchaser for the main library, and I've talked to her many times about because I've gotten her to start listening to some of the interviews that I do on the show, and I've talked to her about your work before, and I think I remember saying before Survivor song, like,
Mhm.
"Hey, make sure you get lots of copies of this one because
Well, thank you.
it's gonna go well." I and by the way, too, that novel, has there been any interest in that? Because I think Survivor Song would make a fantastic movie, but
Yeah, I mean, if anything else, it's probably the closest to something uh being made again. But it's
yeah.
not it's not quite that close. But yes, it's under option.
It's an
Yeah,
easier movie to make than Head Full of Ghosts, I would imagine. Like,
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, that's been forever under option too. So
all right.
fingers crossed.
Well, Paul, thank you for talking to me about Pallbearers Club. This is a fantastic work.
Thank you,
And
David.
of course, when the short story collection comes out, I'm sure I will rope you into another because I definitely want to hear about that. Is that kind of kaiju-ish too, or is it more like the
It's mostly the animals. Like, I mean,
yeah,
it's not a huge spoiler, but like a giant monster comes to this village every certain amount of years, sort of demanding a sacrifice. So, I mean, that's parts of the story, but it's not the whole story.
awesome. That is so cool. All right. Well, any book tour plans too, like for anytime soon or
Yeah, we're still sort of working on that. Like, because it's a short story collection, it was my publisher's fond of saying, not a novel. Like, I'm probably not going too far afield, mostly
right?
New England and stuff like that. But I am going to Minneapolis for the first time to the Loft Festival, I think it's called, or something like that. And that's I'll be there July 8th. I'm very excited. I've never been to Husker Du. I mean, I've never been to Husker Du.
Husker
I've
Du
never been
Land.
to Minneapolis, which is where Husker Du is from. So I'm hoping I have some time to maybe see some, just if nothing else, drive by some places where they might have played or something like that.
Yeah, I highly, I did that with Philip K. Dick. I went to Berkeley and I went to all of his childhood homes, and putting that the tangible, like seeing the addresses and seeing the
Yeah.
things. I bet if you put a little bit of work into it, you can find out like the houses they practiced at and stuff like that. That would be
Mm,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah. For me, like the biggest thing in seeing the Philip K. Dick stuff was well for what the one I had to the house that he wrote Time Out of Join in, I had to go up and touch it because he wrote all of his work in the 50s in that house. And and it was really fascinating too, seeing that he and Ursula Le Guin were high school classmates. They graduated,
Mhm.
never knew each other in high school, but for 2 years in middle school, they lived 6 blocks apart. Apart,
Wow.
and it's just crazy to think about. But I would imagine going to Minneapolis and seeing some of the places that Husker do, like the clubs they played and the things. Like, I think you should definitely make time in that trip for that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna want to hear about that. I'm lucky to. My whole family's from Minnesota originally, so I've spent time around that city and and also Paisley Park. Even though I'm not a huge Prince fan,
Yeah.
it's amazing to see.
Hmm.
So recommend that too.
All right.
All right, well, but you got to come back out at some point to San Diego because you haven't been to the new Mysterious Galaxies. It's bigger.
Oh, I'd love to. I'm dying to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's bigger and better. Stephen just had a huge event there, and I was so stoked at how many people came out. So
Yeah.
it was very good.
That's great.
All right, well, Paul, we'll get people on your short story collection too. I've read a couple of the stories. I'm sure they'll be collected there, but I'm excited to get the new novella. But Paul, it was awesome talking to you. Anything else you want to say to the
Thanks.
folks?
No, thank you for, I hope you enjoy, if you haven't read Pallbearers Club, hope you enjoy it, and, keep an eye out for the beast.
Yeah, we'll see it soon. All right, thanks everybody. And I think our next episode will actually be Jason from the Ray Bradbury Center is coming on to talk about that. And
Cool.
so plan your vacations to Indianapolis. Trust me, I was there. It was an amazing experience. All right, later, folks.